Hi everyone. In the second PowerPoint this week, I want to look at how the legacy of the Vietnam War impacted both the war in Iraq and the presidential election of 2004. A lot of ground to cover in this, so I'm going to try to move somewhat quickly, but not too fast, I hope. So let's get started. At the end of the previous PowerPoint, I mentioned George W. Bush becoming president in the controversial election of 2000. And Bush's presidency was permanently altered by the terrorist attacks, 9/11 attacks, September 2001. Bush was highly influenced by his older, more experienced vice president, Dick Cheney, especially in Bush's first term. Bush's second term, he carves out more independence from Cheney. But Cheney was among those who persuaded Bush to link these attacks to the country of Iraq. Others who influenced Bush's thinking included his Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice. There were others. All of them were among a group identified as neocons, neoconservatives, who believed that the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein and the nation of Iraq had something to do with the September 11th attacks, which was a completely mistaken notion. But the Bush administration didn't waste time presenting a lot of false evidence to buttress its case that somehow Iraq was connected to the terrorist attacks, the 9/11 attacks. And so the Bush administration launches two separate wars after the September 11th attacks. First, to get at Osama bin Laden and terrorist organization Al-Qaeda, which had bases in the nation of Afghanistan. And Afghanistan was under the control of a radical Islamic fundamentalist government, the Taliban. So that's the first conflict, and there are Americans who fight in Afghanistan, although the bulk of the fighting there was actually done by pro-American Afghan forces. Second phase starts in the spring of 2003 when, based on, as I mentioned in the previous slide, a lot of false evidence, all of which was later disproven, Bush administration launches second war with Iraq, the second time that we had fought Iraq since the 1990s. Bush's father had fought a war against Iraq previously. Some of the ways that the legacy of Vietnam impacted this is that the military and the government exercised higher degree of censorship and much greater control over content and the sorts of imagery that Americans saw. Journalists were not given the sort of access that they had during the Vietnam War. And so the imagery that came out, like you see in this picture to the left, early in the conflict, was much more positive. Here, showing Iraqi kids in this village kind of running along happily with an American soldier. Pictures of coffins of Americans killed were not allowed. This was on orders of Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, and that was something the Bush administration didn't want appearing in the media. Photographs like this, these were Pulitzer Prize-winning photographs taken for a photographer by the Los Angeles Times, which only became available here in the United States much later, and these are pictures showing civilians in Baghdad trying to escape as American forces fight their way into the city. And these are the sorts of things that happen in every war, where innocent people, civilians, get caught in the middle. But again, these images were not seen by the American public at the time they happened. And again, this is part of the legacy of the Vietnam War, the Bush administration wanting to exercise far greater control, not just over the flow of information that's available to the American public, but the images that we see that were available to the public as well. And so May 2003, this is just barely 2 months into the war. The war really started in March. Bush makes this televised, splashy, dramatic landing on the American aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, and underneath a banner saying mission accomplished, pretty much proclaims the war in Iraq to be over. What Americans didn't realize is that the war really was entering a new phase, which became known as the insurgency, where a coalition of all sorts of groups, some of them affiliated with the terrorist organization Al Qaeda, begin resistance to the American occupation. And the American occupation wasn't popular with even Iraqis who wanted to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And so this photograph shows the result of this next phase of the war, with American forces arresting and detaining tens of thousands of people. And so this photograph that you saw earlier contrasted with one close-up of an American Marine during the insurgency phase. And it's during this part of the war, and this guy's facial expression clearly shows the strain of combat. And this is the point when the Bush administration starts extending the tours of duty of outfits that had been told they would be sent back to the States right after Saddam Hussein was overthrown. And this included National Guard outfits. It had tours that sometimes were extended 2, 3, 4, even 5 times. And this is where the Bush administration begins to lose control over the type of imagery that the American public is able to see. And by 2004, disturbing images such as these, showing American treatment of detainees, this case, these photos in the notorious Abu Ghraib prison, which had been the main prison used by Saddam Hussein's government. And these slides show what the United States itself would have characterized as torture in previous conflicts. The Bush administration is going to argue that none of this constituted torture and tried to depict some of these actions, like the morbid picture in the lower right, this young woman giving the smiling thumbs up sign over the corpse of an Iraqi detainee. Things like that were excused as the actions of just a few people. And so the Bush administration suddenly found itself on the defensive. And again, this was very similar to what happened to the administration, particularly of Lyndon Johnson with the war in Iraq, with Bush and Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, and others arguing, no, this doesn't constitute torture. These are just harsh interrogation techniques. And as the war in Iraq dragged on, more and more comparisons appeared in the American media, sometimes in the form of political cartoons like this, sometimes in the form of critical essays by different commentators, seen on television, where people began to make comparisons between Iraq and the war in Vietnam. And so these torture photographs came out prior to the election of 2004. So the Iraq War had become extremely controversial. But an amazing thing happened during this election, and that was, instead of the war being a topic of conversation and the focus of the political campaign, we ended up arguing about the Vietnam War. And the person who challenged Bush for the 2004 election, Democratic candidate Senator John Kerry. And as I note here, the Bush campaign successfully turned the election to discussing Kerry's service in the Vietnam War. So here's John Kerry. You see as a young man, first view on the left, the picture on the left, he was captain of what was known as a swift boat in Vietnam, a boat that was involved in river patrol. Kerry came from a wealthy family, could have easily avoided service in Vietnam. He enlisted because he believed in the war And unlike many soldiers, he did 2 tours of duty. But Carey was there during this transitional period. He first went over in '69, and this coincided with the Nixon administration, as we know, beginning withdrawals from Vietnam. And by the time he returned in 1971, as a decorated veteran, he'd been wounded. He had decided the war was a colossal mistake and became one of the chief organizers, founding an organization, Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And you watched some of their protests in a clip a couple weeks ago where they were throwing away their medals and letters of commendation in a protest in Washington, D.C. Carey gave eloquent testimony before Congress about atrocities he had personally witnessed in Vietnam. It's that testimony that the Bush administration dragged up, and veterans who were angry about the fact that Carey had given this testimony spoke out against him. Other Vietnam veterans defended him. We are well aware from what you've learned in this class that My Lai may have been different in terms of its scale, but actions of that sort, massacres of that sort, were fairly commonplace by American forces during the Vietnam War. Vietnamese civilians suffered horribly during this conflict. So Carey was speaking the truth, but some veterans just never forgave him for it. And so there were a whole series of damaging ads run against him during the campaign. And as I said, instead of talking about the Iraq War, which was the dominant political issue, we were refighting the Vietnam War in 2004. In contrast to Carey, Bush's service received no scrutiny at all. Bush could have been drafted like many young men of that era. He sought safety by enlisting in the National Guard. In Bush's case, in a unit of the Texas Air National Guard. We know that Bush got preferential treatment. As you might expect, National Guard outfits all over the country had long lists of men wanting to join as an alternative to being drafted and sent to Vietnam, because presidents had made it clear during the Vietnam War the National Guard would not be used in combat. So it was a way to fulfill your military obligation without risking being sent to Vietnam and potentially killed. The unit Bush joined looked like him, meaning that all the people in it were white, wealthy, privileged young men. There's evidence that Bush never even finished his term. He requested a transfer to Alabama, where he began working on a political campaign of a family friend there. He's never answered direct questions about that. Bush's answer when he was asked about this over the years was always to say, "I was honorably discharged," which is true, but he's never answered the question, did you fulfill your required time in the National Guard? I can't say conclusively that he didn't, but the available evidence suggests that he did not. So the selection of 2004 provides an incredible example of the Vietnam War being completely intrusive, overshadowing what should have been the real issue in the election of 2004, which was the war in Iraq. And I think the main takeaway from this is to show that even at that stage, 2004, the American public was still intensely divided about the Vietnam War, its meaning, its legacy, and that carried over to veterans who were of divided opinion too, with some veterans, as I said, speaking out in support of Carey, others criticizing him. And as I've mentioned in this class before, Carey is another example proving my point that you can be criticized for what you did in the Vietnam War no matter what choice you made. You can be criticized for having not served in Vietnam, and as Carey's experience shows, you can be heavily criticized for having voluntarily served in Vietnam. And this is part of the complicated legacy that Vietnam veterans have had to bear.